This presentation is about the Battle of Midway in 1942, the most pivotal battle in all of World War II, a war where more people died than any war in history. 50 million, enough to fill Dodger Stadium 1,000 times. But let's start by considering the special place of World War II in American history. While all other wars had enormous pockets of resistance, World War II produced virtually no anti-war movement. It has been called the last good war for that reason. In World War II, the United States played a vital role in defeating Nazi Germany, one of the most evil regimes in human history. It also elevated the United States to superpower status. Millions of women entered the workforce to aid in the war effort, and despite great pressure for them to return to their homes after the war, many of these American women chose to stay in the workforce. For Black Americans, the experience of World War II emboldened them to return to the United States for civil rights. World War II ended the Great Depression and began a 25-year economic boom. In order for all this to happen, the U.S. and its allies had to win the war, and so now we will examine the key battle that ensured American victory in World War II, the Battle of Midway.
In this presentation, we will cover 4 areas. First, we'll look at the rise of Imperial Japan in the 1930s and the spread of its dominance in the Pacific. Then, we will look at the state of the U.S. military prior to World War II and following the attack on Pearl Harbor. Third, we'll take a close look at the Battle of Midway to see how the U.S. won the battle. And finally, we'll assess the impact of the battle on the outcome of the Second World War.
Japan's emergence as a rising power began in the early 20th century when it defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. President Theodore Roosevelt helped end this war by negotiating the peace treaty. For doing this, he received the Nobel Peace Prize. In the years that followed, Japan built up its military and sought to position itself as a dominant power in the Pacific. By the 1920s, Japan's rise to power had really begun to worry U.S. officials. The United States had very important island possessions in the Pacific, such as the Philippines, Guam, and Samoa, and the United States feared for their security as Japan grew stronger. The United States was also concerned about the security of substantial investments in China made by U.S. corporations.
For a time by the 1920s, the United States and Japan were able to reach an accommodation, largely because they signed a number of international treaties on arms reduction and trade policy in the Pacific. But by the 1930s, Japan's government became increasingly nationalistic and committed to transforming Japan into a regional empire, regardless of international criticism. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, a region now part of China. 6 years later, in 1937, Japan invaded China. The Chinese military fled before the disciplined and powerful Japanese forces, and Japan soon controlled a vast portion of China. The Japanese needed new resources, new sources of energy and raw materials in particular. Japan had few resources and therefore relied very heavily on imports. To give one example, about 80% of Japan's oil came from the United States.
Tensions with the United States began to rise over the next 3 years, from 1937 to 1940. And when World War II started in Europe, the Roosevelt administration sought tougher economic sanctions against Japan. In 1940, Congress passed the Export Control Act, which sharply reduced exports of oil, iron, and steel to Japan. Roosevelt believed that this measure would help contain Japan, sort of cut off a little bit of their supplies and make them behave and curtail their expansionism. The Japanese government, however, interpreted these sanctions as an act of hostility. Then, after Japan's military continued to seize more and more of Southeast Asia in the summer of 1941, Congress stepped up the sanction to a complete and total embargo, a total cutoff in trade. and Congress froze all Japanese assets in the United States. It was at this point that the Japanese decided to attack Pearl Harbor.
This was a big gamble by Japan. They thought the United States was not ready for a major offensive in the Pacific. Japan believes that if they struck us hard enough at Pearl Harbor in the Philippines and other strategic points in the Pacific, they could deal a death blow to the United States fleet and compel the United States to withdraw from the Pacific. So on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. Navy base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii.
The attack on Pearl Harbor inflicted significant damage on U.S. naval assets. 2,000 American servicemen were killed, 187 aircraft destroyed, 18 naval vessels were damaged or destroyed. But Pearl Harbor was not the knockout blow Japan had hoped for. 6 of the 8 battleships that were hit were repaired and put back into service in a relatively short period of time. And, most significantly, none of the massive and hard-to-replace aircraft carriers in this fleet had been destroyed. They had been sent away from Pearl Harbor on maneuvers just a few days earlier, and so they escaped the assault. The next day, President Roosevelt declared December 7th a date which would live in infamy, and asked Congress to declare war on Japan. The vote was 477 to 1. If you are curious as to who voted against going to war with the Japanese, it was Jeannette Rankin, a Montana congresswoman who was the first woman elected to Congress. She also voted against World War I while in Congress. In 1968, at the age of 88, Jeannette Rankin marched to protest the Vietnam War.
The U.S. was finally in the war, but remember, the war between other nations had begun September of 1939, over 2 years before Pearl Harbor. At this point, we need to ask an important question. What was the state of the U.S. military in December of 1941? The U.S. was pretty much where it always was at the start of a major war, ill-prepared. Through all of American history up to World War II, the U.S. fought its wars following basically a 5-step process. Step 1, declare war. Step 2, realize, oh no, we don't have an army or a navy. Step 3, build an army and a navy very rapidly. Step 4, win the war. Step 5, dismantle the military. The U.S. did this every time throughout its wars, not because it was stupid, but because of the deeply held fear of a standing army. Americans associated standing armies with tyranny, so they kept their armies very small during peacetime.
The situation in 1941 was not as bad as it could have been. Despite isolationist sentiment and several neutrality acts that were passed by Congress, FDR managed a modest pre-war buildup. The Army, which had numbered only 175,000 in 1939, had risen to 1.5 million by 1941. This was still a far cry from the eventual total of 16 million servicemen and women who would fill the ranks by 1945. So it was better than usual, but still far short of what America would eventually need. But war is about much more than soldiers and sailors. It's about stuff. What kind of stuff? You need ships, tanks, trucks, planes, guns, radios, uniforms, helmets, boots, foods, medicines. You need a lot of stuff. By 1941, American industry had begun to ramp up and shake off the dust of the Great Depression. It would take time, months, and even years in some cases for the full power of American industry to be focused on the war effort and churn out the massive quantities of wartime material needed to win.
In the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, America was not only ill-prepared to fight wars in Europe and in the Pacific, the American people were also quite terrified, and this was especially true here in California, where Americans feared a Japanese invasion. This fear, combined with anti-Asian racism It's a call for the removal of all people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. And this anti-Japanese hysteria reached such a fever pitch that President Roosevelt eventually capitulated. In February of 1942, he authorized the removal of about 110,000 Japanese Americans, most of them American citizens, to internment camps on the interior. Today, we deeply regret this decision. The main point here is that the United States was both anxious and unprepared.
What about the Japanese, our opponent in this war? The situation was essentially the reverse. Japan had been building its military for a decade, and in 1941, Japan possessed the largest and most powerful aircraft carrier force in the world. It also had the world's largest and most advanced naval air fleet. The Japanese were also brimming with confidence, and they had won many quick and decisive victories over the previous few years, including a smashing victory at Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. It didn't stop after that. It followed that victory with the seizure over the next few weeks of Thailand, Hong Kong, Guam, and Wake Island. In January 1942, Japan invaded Burma, the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. In February, Japan seized Bali, Timor, and Singapore. In March, Japan seized Java. The list goes on and on. Then on May 6th, Japan took the Philippines, which was a key American possession. The fall of the Philippines included the surrender of Bataan. At Bataan, 78,000 American and Filipino troops surrendered to the Japanese. This was the largest American force to surrender in U.S. history. They were subsequently forced to march to prison camps, a grueling ordeal known as the Bataan Death March, which killed thousands.
Here is a map of the Japanese Empire at its peak in 1942. The red portion is Japan, the pink portion is Manchuria and Korea, which they occupied in 1932. The yellow part is Mongolia, which they occupied in 1937, and the purple portion is what Japan occupied by 1942, which is almost all of Indochina. The U.S. faced a formidable task in taking on Imperial Japan. The first major clash was the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942. In this battle, the United States won a strategic victory because they stopped a large Japanese fleet that was advancing on Australia for an invasion. While the United States suffered heavy losses, the Japanese lost an aircraft carrier. And in naval warfare, that is a big piece. The thing that matters the most, not only did they lose that aircraft carrier, but the Japanese were not used to losing battles. They had not lost one in a very long time.
In the aftermath of this battle, Admiral Yamamoto, the commander of the entire Japanese fleet, responded with a bold plan. The Japanese would seize the island of Midway, which is about 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Midway was a key U.S. possession, a really strategic point for the military right in the middle of the Pacific that served as an important refueling station for ships and planes. Japan planned to seize it and turn it into their own major air and naval base from which they could pretty much control all of the Central Pacific. Yamamoto devised a two-part strategy. First, the Japanese Navy would stage a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska, and this would ideally divert the U.S. naval assets up in that direction. If you look on the globe, you will see how close the Aleutian Islands are to the action we are describing here. Flat maps are too distorted to appreciate the short distances we are talking about.
Part 2 of this plan was that after a large part of the Navy was diverted up north and occupied there, Japan would launch a major attack on Midway, and this would draw in the remaining U.S. fleet, drawing them into a trap where a much more powerful Japanese Navy would destroy them. Yamamoto had good reason to be confident. His fleet included 4 aircraft carriers and, of course, hundreds of aircraft on them, plus many battleships and cruisers, so he had a large fleet to pull this off. On paper, it was a great plan, and if it succeeded, Japan would enjoy almost total domination of Asia and the Pacific for years to come. But Yamamoto was unaware of 2 crucial things.
First, his plan assumed that the United States had only 2 operational aircraft carriers in the region near Midway, and neither one would play a major role in the battle. His second assumption was that his plans were secret. Yamamoto had no way of knowing that American cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese code, and Americans knew far more about what the Japanese were going to do than the Japanese could have imagined. Yamamoto had no way of knowing that Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, knew in advance the details of the Japanese plan.
Nimitz now knew the attack on the Aleutian Islands was a ruse, so he didn't divert a lot of U.S. naval assets in that direction. He focused on Midway, where he knew the big offensive would be. In effect, Nimitz planned to turn the intended Japanese trap designed to destroy the American fleet into an American trap designed to destroy the Japanese fleet. This was a monumental turning of the tables. The hunter had become the hunted. Nimitz dispatched 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown to Midway, the very carriers that Yamamoto assumed would not be present. Yamamoto and his commanders were so certain of the brilliance of their plan, they actually conducted very little forward reconnaissance. So they didn't know that these carriers were on their way and about to hit them very hard. Yamamoto's surprise was about to become Nimitz's surprise.
The Battle of Midway began at 4:30 a.m. on June 4th, 1942. Vice Admiral Nagumo, the commander of the Japanese carrier group, launched a wave of over 100 planes to bomb Midway Island. At the same time, he also sent 7 scout planes out across the Pacific to find the American fleet, hoping to lure them into the devastating trap he had prepared. The first wave of Japanese planes over Midway encountered almost no resistance at all, and they were able to inflict serious damage on Midway's military installation. At this point, Vice Admiral Nagumo was confident of victory, and he decided to launch a second and more devastating aerial attack on Midway.
This required that he switch things up a bit. He had to bring out a reserve squadron of aircraft, and these aircraft had been equipped with aerial torpedoes that were for attacking ships. In order to make the second attack on the island of Midway, he had to rearm those planes with bombs. This was not a difficult task, but it was time-consuming. So for the next hour, his men took the torpedoes off the planes and fitted them with bombs.
While all this was underway, Japanese scout planes radioed back that they had found the American fleet. Now Admiral Nagumo had to make a fateful decision, and it made sense, given the assumptions about the American fleet, which he thought was very weak. Nagumo decided to stop rearming for a second attack on Midway and instead go after the American fleet. This meant that he had to tell the crews that were switching the armaments on these planes that the land bombs just put on would have to be taken off again and replaced with the aerial bombs they'd earlier removed.
This was going to take some time. More importantly, and this one of those little details that made a huge difference in the Battle of Midway. Because of this rapid change in plans, the decks of the Japanese carriers were covered in armaments, in bombs, and torpedoes. The planes were also being refilled, and their decks of the carriers were crisscrossed with fuel lines. When out of nowhere, a wave of American planes arrived and attacked the carriers. Where did these planes come from? The Americans had sent out scout planes, out just like the Japanese had, so long before the Japanese scouts had found the U.S. fleet. American scouts had found the Japanese fleet.
At 7 a.m., Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher began launching his aircraft in the direction of the Japanese fleet. The first squadron, of the sluggish American torpedo bombers, attacked the Japanese. These were from the Hornet and the Enterprise, and none of them scored a hit. Almost all were shot down and their crews killed. But ironically, this had to happen for the next stage of the battle to unfold.
These torpedo bombers' presence
caused a panic for the Japanese, and instead of the Japanese fighters flying high above to form a protective canopy for the carriers, they dropped altitude, expecting more low-flying torpedo bombers to come at them any moment. This decision was fatal, for just as the Japanese were looking down low and putting their efforts into protecting themselves from torpedo bombers from high above, American high-altitude bombers came roaring in towards the carriers from two different directions. They converged on the three carriers, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Akagi.
Remember, the decks were covered with bombs, torpedoes, and fuel lines. And so as the American planes dropped their bombs on these carriers, there was a chain reaction explosion, like a small match beginning a giant fire when thrown on a pile of gasoline-soaked rags. The real explosions began. Within moments, all three carriers were crippled, and in a few minutes they were consumed in flames. Over the next few hours, one by one, the great aircraft carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy went to the bottom, along with thousands of sailors and pilots who called these carriers home.